Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Sara Stefanini.
Thank you. I would like to first introduce my guest, Maros Šefčovič, Vice President of the European Commission in charge of the Energy Union, which includes everything from energy supply security to climate change to clean mobility and many other things. But today we're here to talk about the Paris Climate Agreement and specifically how things have gone, what's happened since, it's been nearly a year now since President Donald Trump announced that he intended to withdraw. I think one common misperception that we have to make clear is that the US hasn't actually withdrawn yet because the rules don't allow it to do so for 4 years. However, we have seen a very different approach in the US, from the US government to these international negotiations. Even recently, the International Maritime Organization, where they talked about climate change strategy for shipping and other places. But yeah, first, before we begin, we've got an introductory video just to lay out the scene for us. So
I won the copy. Yeah.
So that's a scene setter for you. So I mean, we've got the Paris Climate Agreement, which aims to decarbonize, to be carbon neutral by 2050. But there are still negotiations going on over the rules to actually achieve the Paris Agreement, and the rule book is due in December at the COP24 in Poland. There are still very deep divisions between the developed and developing world. How have the talks suffered without the weight of Washington and Obama kind of pushing in for a deal?
Of course, we are missing our American friends at the negotiating table, and I have to say that it's definitely not easier, because one of the key predicaments for the success of Paris was there was very close cooperation between Europeans and Americans. We've been working together on the best approach to China, to the developing world, and in the end, I think the Paris Agreement is a true milestone where the mankind, for the first time, decided to do a right thing. So therefore, for us, it was really very disappointing to see that United States government decided to leave Paris Agreement, and I had the chance just a few weeks after that to attend the Mission Innovation and Clean Energy Ministerial in China, where my new colleague Rick Perry was attending as well, and Rick was trying to do his utmost to present the priorities of the US government, that we are ready to continue our cooperation in innovations, in new technologies, in many other things, but not on climate. And I told him, you know, Rick, if you're not at the table, you are not at the table. And of course, the result of it was that it put much closer together in this climate cooperation China, Europe, and Canadians. And this is actually the trio which is going to push for the success of the next Mission Innovation and Clean Energy Ministry, which will take place next week in Copenhagen and Malmö. And I have to say that from the moment of that announcement, there was I would say, huge expectation, especially from the developing world, but also from China, that you Europeans carry on. Don't let us in a difficult situation, and please cover the gap left by Americans. But at the same time, we are doing our best. We will talking about the financing, so we will come to the figures later on. But it's clear that this global talks, the United States is missing. What I want to add on the positive side of the thing, I am working very closely with Mike Bloomberg. We are both co-chairs of the Global Covenant of Mayors, and I have to say that I never seen such a positive energy coming from states like California and New York and many others, from the mayors, but also from the business leaders who simply want to convince us all that the US can do it even without the White House. And that's what I found very, very positive, that the concrete action on the ground is taking place. But if it comes to global talks, green financing, and I would say the overall diplomatic effort, which you need to maintain to have success in Katowice at COP24, of course we are missing our American friends.
And that, I mean, diplomatically, obviously a lot of the pressure fell to the EU to take the mantle as leader. The EU created the Ministerial on Climate Action with China and Canada. They're meeting again in June in Brussels. What in the last year, where have you really focused your diplomatic efforts to fill that leadership gap?
I think that the first thing we wanted to clearly show that we Europeans are trying to lead by example. So we are the first major economy which transform all the commitments we have undertaken in Paris into the binding European laws, into the binding legislation, and this is already done. And if we are talking about the emission trading system or our system for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from transport, from aviation, from shipping, and from many other areas, we really did our homework, and we are completely transforming our energy systems, which would be based increasingly more and more on renewable energy. So we did our homework. We are just showing to the rest of the world, look, this transition is possible. We cut our greenhouse gas emission by 24%. At the same time, we grew by almost 60%. So you can have that split. You can lower your emission and you can grow economically. And then, of course, we are working very actively with developing countries who are quite concerned if that pledge of these 100 billion US dollars by 2020 will be respected. How we are going to cover the lack of financing for climate projects from United States. And again, what we are doing is that we increased the climate financing in 2016. I think it was more than 20 billion euros from our side. But we know that to get to that level, which we agreed and accepted when the Paris Agreement was negotiated, that we need to mobilize much more the money from the private sector. And for that, we also developed a new instrument. We call it external investment instrument, where we want to use the same leverage as we did it with the Juncker Investment Fund in Europe, and bring in this way until 2020 additional 40 billion of euros of investment. So this is what we do, but of course more would be needed, and a lot of efforts will have to be deployed when we want to be successful in Katowice.
Okay, and we do have one more video, which is you just discussed, you met former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger to talk about investment in climate. So let's see that.
Hero with my friend Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. I was hoping to bring him to GlobeSec conference to Bratislava this year, but I hope we can invite you next year, because we are doing a lot together in Africa. We are supporting a lot of projects, and with support of Arnold, everything gets done much easier.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And I really appreciate all the work that you're doing, because you're one of the very few leaders that is really talking about the need of matching up green projects with the investors.
Yeah.
And you, especially when it comes to Africa, you want to build green projects there and find investors. And that's what we are trying to do through the R20 now, to match them up because, as you said, there's so many great projects out there, but they can't find the funding. And there's so many investors that want to invest in projects, but they can't find the shovel-ready projects. So this is up to us now to bring the two together and to go and start building more green projects because I think it's so important.
So when I came, Arnold just checked me how much money did I bring.
Yeah,
so
always, always. Whenever I see him, I go and kind of pat him down to just see where's the wallet, where are the credit cards, and then I'm going to go and take it away from him.
And we discovered that he never was in Slovakia, so we really hope that next year we'll do it together, and I'm
Absolutely.
sure that everybody will be very happy to welcome you.
Absolutely, you're a great friend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Arnold.
very much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
thanks a lot. Thank you.
So we can expect him next year.
No, as I said, he's my favorite climate action hero, Arnold, and I wanted to bring him here because then I'm sure that this room would be too small for us. so he is, of course, a very charismatic leader who did a lot in California, and he draws enormous crowd, and he passes the messages which I think the world needs to hear. And as you said, he has strong focus on Africa, and there where we are trying to help as well.
And so we saw in Bonn talks just a couple of weeks ago where they're preparing for the COP24. Money just always remains a big sticking point between developed and developing countries. And one thing Trump has done is say that he'll withhold about $2 billion in funding for the UN's Green Climate Fund. But 2 billion is quite small when you think that the goal, the pledge is 100 billion per year mobilized, $100 billion per year mobilized by 2020. So what kinds of initiatives, you are seeing more businesses go in that direction, but it's still a bit piecemeal. What kinds of initiatives are needed to actually get to that map and to reassure developing countries?
I think if it comes to COP24 and Katowice, currently we are in the middle of extremely complex expert negotiations on financing, on transparency of the whole process, and of course on the single rule book, meaning that we would have the comparable rules which would allow us to really see if the countries, if the parties to the agreement are respecting the commitments or not. And that will not be easy negotiations, and we will do our utmost to help the Polish presidency to arrive as a positive outcome, because we need its single rule book. Of course, parts of the creating the atmosphere for the successful diplomatic outcome clearly would be how can we secure the adequate financing. So we've been working a lot on sustainable financing, on green bonds, and what we want to use in Africa is, as I said, I would say a little bit the mirroring of the good performance of the Juncker Investment Fund in Europe, which works on the basis of guarantees, so that we tell the potential investors, you are hesitating, you would invest, but you still are worried that the project is too risky. So let's do it together, and any eventual first losses are on us, are on the EU budget. So don't worry, come and invest. And with this, we managed to generate in Africa, in Europe over the last few years, almost 300 billion euros, with actually quite limited budget for the initial seeded money. But we've been working very closely with the European Investment Bank, with the development banks, and this is something what we are now going to propose and try out in Africa through our external investment fund. And then, of course, my colleague Valdis Dombrovskis is working a lot on introduction of the green bonds to make sure that the investment would go to the right projects, and we would avoid something which is known as a greenwashing, that you pretend that it's actually climate-related project, and then when you study it more carefully, you discover that it's something else. So all this is happening right now, and if you ask me if there is enough money, my short answer would be yes, and I'm basing it on the fact that quite often I have in my offices different banking associations, pension fund associations. And one memorable meeting which I had was that I had a group of representatives in my office, and they proudly told me we are controlling assets worth of 13 trillion euros. Somebody from Slovakia, you cannot believe that such a money exists, but you know, they've been the guys in the room telling me that this is the assets we control, and we are actually under a lot of pressure from our shareholders to invest in a climate related project, to invest in a green project and help us to do it, play that intermediary. So I think that the potential of the private investors is huge. There is public expectations, there is corporate social responsibility, there is really demand that the investors would go through this climate mainstreaming, and we see that banks are increasing that percentage every year. European budget for next 7 years will be done in a way that each fourth euro, so 5% would be climate related. And for the banking institutions, it's the same. So we just need to help the developing countries to have a good project. We have to help them to get the investments into that direction and increase the positive perception that
So
this is good thing to do.
It's shifting more from toward investment support rather than development aid or climate aid.
I think that
as
it
an
would be
approach.
really a combination of that. I discussed it with UNFCCC director, with Patricia Espinosa in Vienna. And of course, you would always have a projects where the grants would be irreplaceable, simply because or the country is at such a shape, or the projects are so difficult to monetize that you need to create the groundwork, the infrastructure where the grants would be needed. But I think really much more can be done by hybrid financing, multi-source financing, and all this would be explored, because we know in what shapes the budget across the world does, and it's difficult to expect that we can really get to the level which is needed in the development world just based on the public budget transfers.
And going back to the US for a second in this as well, I mean, in the past year, even though Trump did announce a year ago that he wanted to withdraw, we've actually seen some of the pro-Paris voices in the administration leave. George Banks, who was an advisor, and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. And also the EU has had in the past bilateral energy and climate dialogues with the US, but as far as I know, you haven't since the Trump administration came. What are your plans going forward? Are you still talking to Washington? Do you think the dialogues could be resumed?
I think we of course are talking to our American partners, and I think we have very good relationship with Rick Perry. But I have to say that currently we are going probably through the most difficult period of EU-US relationship since Second World War. And I mean, Paris was the first stepping out of the international treaty. Iran deal was the second walking away of the treaty which we jointly negotiated, and which on top of it is kind of certified by the UN resolution. Then we had these difficulties how the WTO should be operating, and that of course creates a lot of tension and a lot of difficulties. And to be quite honest, we do not understand that very well. That how come we could be in this shape when we are talking about closest of allies. I mean, we are the NATO allies, we share the same values, we've been always working side by side on the most difficult diplomatic challenges, and now we are talking tariffs, now we are talking sanctions against European companies, and now we are talking trade war. I mean, that's really not what definitely we in the European Commission hoped for. And I still remember being here, I think 2 or 3 years ago, when I was like super supporter of TTIP. Where did we move from then? We've been looking for the possibility of biggest trade agreement on this planet, which would really generate the billions of dollars and euros of revenues, really millions of the new job. And now we moved from the TTIP to the sanctions and to the debate about possible trade war. So, of course, I can tell you that because the European Commission is responsible for external trade, that we, and especially my colleague Cecilia Malmström, I think she had 9 very long teleconferences with her counterparts in US. So we'll do everything possible and impossible to avoid this situation and really to find the common ground, as I believe we as allies should do. But if that would be not possible, so then I think we will go through the another rough patch, and this would just add to the, I would say, number of problems we have on our transatlantic bridge. So it's climate, it's trade, it would be that would be sanction. I'm sure a lot of legal disputes about this, and I don't think it's good for our mutual relationship, and I don't think it's good for the world.
And just briefly now, because we're running out of time, but the European Commission is now coming up with the 2050 climate strategy, which all countries have to submit by 2020 or in 2020 under the Paris Agreement. Also, given the US standing back, the EU is under a lot of pressure from developing countries, from NGOs, from others, to do more, to both raise its 2030 targets and come up with 2050 targets that are in line with decarbonization. What can we expect?
Yeah. I think I would quote Secretary General Guterres, who visited just 2 days ago in Brussels. And despite of all that drama we have today in international relations, for him, the number one danger for the mankind is climate change. And he saw the first results of the analysis which will be presented to all of us in the autumn, where we have moved in the fight against climate change. And he said that all of us and all scientists, we heavily underestimated how this process got accelerated over the last 2 years and what kind of irreparable damage would be caused to the planet if you would see the permafrost in Siberia melting or further melting of the ice caps and a lot of further consequences. So, and the problem is that, of course, in the United States you have hurricanes. In Europe we have floods, we have droughts. But the regions which are suffering the most are actually the most vulnerable countries in Africa, where this climate change is creating enormous migratory pressure because simply they cannot live in these new climate conditions. So his appeal was be serious, accelerate your action, and lead the world on fight against climate change. So this would be clearly reflected in our strategy. We would wait for the presentation of UNFCCC report, which will be presented early autumn, and I'm sure that we would reconfirm our long-term goal that we want to do our utmost so we could live in the second half of the century in carbon neutral world.
So will it be in line with the 1.5 degree goal?
I think that at this stage we will not come with new targets or the new goals for the individual member states, because what we approved right now and what has in the meantime become the European law is these are actually the targets which should brought us to 95% of greenhouse gas emission cut by 2050. And we have already introduced the review of all our targets yearly in the next decade. But what definitely you will see will be proposal how to update our processes, how to set up the work for the future, and how to react to this new report. So definitely we want to respond positively to those reports, which we are expecting to be presented in autumn, and then look for the ways how Europe could really show that it's up for that required leadership.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, that's all the time we've got. We look forward to that 2050 report then, and all the work ahead before the COP24. We've got a coffee break now, and then starting at 3:30 in this room, Maria Theresia, we've got Populism, Is the Tide Over Yet? In the Danube space, Trump's Transatlantic Bond. And in the Habsburg room, Remote-Controlled Terrorism, What's the Price of Freedom? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.